Welcome to the Darkstream. Voxday, voxday.blogspot.com, and unauthorized.tv. Thanks for tuning in. These are what Robert Heinlein called the crazy years, which is kind of impressive when you think about it, in that Heinlein was kind of crazy himself. So, this is supposedly a national holiday, but the nation is not the state. One of the big lies that people have been convinced over time is that state is synonymous with nation. It's not true. You can have a nation without a state, like, for example, the Jewish people for many years. You can have, or the Catalonian people with their own language. You can have a state that does not have a single people. That's what we call an empire. And so it's a mistake to confuse the political entity with the genetic group of people, the extended family known as a nation. Well, the USA is about as close as a state without a nation gets, because the American nation, which is essentially the British immigrants, is so deracinated, so denationalized, so demoralized, and so civic nationalized that they no longer have the ability to think of themselves as a people. And that's why Americans tend to fall so easily for nonsense, because they've been told that their nation is just an idea. And that's why you had people like Muammar Gaddafi saying that America belongs to everyone. Because if the nation is just an idea, then anyone can hold the idea, and anyone who is actually of the genetic nation can fail to hold the idea. And so it's it just, Canada, for example, is also very denationalized because of the way that it was formed. Canada was a part British, it's part British nation, part French nation. And so, that's always a fundamental weakness. And so, the civic nationalism that we were taught when we were young, I'm Generation X, we believed in it. We bought it. The songs convinced us, the iconology convinced us, but it's not true. And it's never been true. And so, and you're seeing that happening, and that's why the nations that are the most homogenous, whether it's as a result of communism, this to me is the greatest irony of all. Who would have imagined for 5 seconds, who would have ever imagined that communism would be better for a nation than liberal democracy. I mean, as awful as North Korea is, as you know, I'm reading a novel right now, a Japanese novel that posits it's crazy, but it posits a partial invasion of Kyushu, in southern Japan, by forces from North Korea, and it's completely it's lunatic. The author's a lunatic, the story's a lunatic, the story's crazy, but for all the uncountable horrors of the system of rule and the ideology of North Korea, the one thing that you can't argue is that North Korea remains Korean. The author's name is Ru Murakami. Definitely not to be confused with Haruki Murakami. And so it's really astonishing to me as a former libertarian, as a former civic nationalist, to realize that one of the great evils, the ideology of communism, was actually better for most of the nations that it dominated over the second half of the 20th century than liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is an absolute cancer. And all of these meandering, angst-ridden thought pieces in foreign affairs and commentary and all the pseudo-intellectual globalist journals that are fretting about how so many lesser countries are now moving more towards the Chinese model rather than embracing the globalism of Western Europe and the United States. And that's because they can see what works and what doesn't. And it's very, very clear that the crack that the United States government started smoking back in 1965 has proven to be absolutely lethal. And the American empire is rapidly ending. There's a reason why the Trump administration marks one of the first times in any presidential term that no new little wars have been started, is because the U.S. military is going to lose the next big war it gets into. It's kind of funny. It says the Civ Nats say that the globalists want to divide us all in the U.S. Everyone's already divided. The civic nationalism is total nonsense. It doesn't work at all. Civic nationalism couldn't even keep the Czechs and the Slovaks wanting to live under the same rule. Hall Long Bear said, so the Republic basically lasted than 75 years? Well, yes, the Republic failed, 7 years. The Republic failed when the Yankee states militarily invaded the South and established the empire. Now, it doesn't matter why the southern states wanted to secede. You can blame it on slavery if you want to, or whatever. I'm not interested in getting into all of that. But the point is that the empire was established then. And so what we've seen is that the period of, it's just like with Rome. I mean, keep in mind, you don't need an emperor to have an empire. Who was the emperor of Athens? Didn't exist. And so Laughing Man is correct. Lincoln created the Continental Empire. Wilson created the World Empire. The Republic failed. The Empire replaced it. The Empire continued. And now the Empire is failing. And so when you, this is a normal procedure. This is how history tends to work. And so, if people in the United States are lucky, then you'll see people voluntarily segregating, voluntarily separating, and voluntarily forming their own nations, which will eventually become states. Eventually the states will become more and more independent. You're already seeing people wanting to do that. We have the regrettably short-lived Republic of Chaz. Regrettably, it's already disappeared. But you're going to see more of that. You're going to see it on a larger scale. And so, and that's a good thing. Just so you understand, it's not a bad thing. It's a normal thing. Remember the words of the famous beginning. I think it's from the Three Kingdoms. The empire, long divided, must unite. The empire, long united, must divide. So that's how that's the pattern. That's how it works. And so, but and it's hard for those of us who were happy with a situation. It's hard for us to accept and understand that the situation has changed, that we've lost that world, that it's never going back to that. It's never going back to 1980s U.S. white suburban culture. Not across the whole country. And it's actually interesting when you watch movies or news reports set in the 80s in London or in Minneapolis. It's fascinating to see how different it looks just in living memory. I was there. I saw it. And you can see why the younger generations look at the 90s and look at the 80s and wish they had the chance to live in that environment, because it's something that they've never known. And it's a tragedy in some ways, but you can't go back in time. You have to deal with the world as it exists. You have to deal with things the way they are. But what I would encourage you to understand and to accept is that if you've been sitting there thinking about, well, when it gets bad around here, then I'm going to do X, Y, or Z. I think this is the time to start doing it. I think this is the time to go ahead and move out of Los Angeles, or move out of Boston, or move away from the suburbs of Atlanta. This is probably the last time, the last period where you can be relatively certain that you can make that move in peace without any significant problems. I'm not saying that anything is going to happen necessarily today, tomorrow, or 3 months from now, but it's I think it's time to stop thinking about things, and I think it's time to start making decisions. I think it's time to start realizing that the long predicted crazy years are now upon us, because we're just seeing too much. We're seeing too much craziness. We're seeing too much nonsense all over the place. I went to school 4 blocks away from where the Minneapolis riots and fires were all started. That was unthinkable. Couldn't imagine it. So I think Smart Alec Production says, is Europe a safer long-term plan? That you can't come to Europe now. It's too late. It's been really interesting to see the change in the attitude towards Americans in America since I moved here, 21, 22 years ago. It used to be when we first arrived over here, saying that you were from America, like they were puzzled. Like, why are you here? Why would you ever come here? Why would you rather be here? They couldn't understand it. And it was kind of funny because every single high school kid that you talk to would tell you confidentially that, their dream was to one day visit America. And it was really funny because they would all say it. Every single one of them. And, I'm not saying that nobody wants to go there. People are still, interested in seeing the places that they've seen in the movies and stuff. Just like, the same way a lot of people want to go and be a tourist in Italy. But it's a more normal attitude now. It's not like, it's just not like it was. And I wouldn't say, and for the first time about maybe it was 7-8 years ago, I heard people complaining, American expats complaining that they were being called names, treated badly, prejudiced. There's prejudice against them and stuff, which was really startling to me because that was the exact opposite of the experience that we had had. And so but I think that, and remember, the United States is a very, very big place. Find where your family and your friends and like-minded people are. That's the answer. The answer is always family, extended family, nation. Wrath of Mark says, I thought Obama restored American prestige abroad. Yeah, that's the media. Isn't America still like 20% of world immigration destination? Well, yeah, that's the problem. The problem with the United States is that it is the recipient of the largest movement of people in human history. And so that's always led to war. That's always led to problems. And so it's not, I mean, here's the thing. When people say, do you see this becoming a hot conflict? Where? The Civil War wasn't fought everywhere. The Civil War was nightmarish in some places, and in other places, people didn't even really know what was happening. So, wow, Kurt Doolittle is going to sign a Declaration of Reformation about the proprietarian ideology. I find it difficult to imagine anything that could possibly be less significant. But, good luck to them. If it works, fantastic. So anyhow, that's all I'm really saying is that Americans are not independent. Americans are conquered. Americans are, ruled by the empire, and it's too bad, but that's the case. And so you need to understand that, you need to accept that, and you need to be actively preparing for when the empire starts to spin apart, as all empires do. So, so the important thing, to do is to stop waiting for things to happen. Stop waiting for a sign beyond the signs that you're getting. There's plenty of decay. There's plenty of ruin in a large empire. Things are not going to fall apart completely tomorrow. The toilets are not going to stop working in August. But but it is time to realize that the crazy years have arrived. So now, before we do that's all I have to say about that particular subject. But I also wanted to address another subject that is of some interest to folks, which is, of course, the response to the lawsuit filed by Patreon against 72 of its users, all of whom are bears, as the supporters of Owen Benjamin are known. And so what I thought might be interesting would be to take a look at that response, because it's not something that I was involved in. And so it was interesting to see what the lawyers came up with and so forth, and just to see how the difference between what they do and what the Legion does. And so if that's of interest, I'm not going to take any questions right now because I can't see the questions. I can't see them and read this at the same time. So just hold on to your questions for a bit. Or what I'll do is I'll pause occasionally and to take questions. So let me zoom in a little bit here. Okay. So Patreon demands all claims be arbitrated on an individual basis. This is correct. That's straight from their terms of use. It made its own rules and put up hurdles in the hope that users would be discouraged from trying to seek justice due to its insistence on private arbitration. This is very, very lofty. I'm impressed. Now when the users do what Patreon made them do, Patreon says the rules have changed and it doesn't have to follow the rules. Therefore, the injunction should not issue. What Patreon's asking for is they're asking for the court to tell the arbitration system that people are not allowed to go into arbitration. So the factual background, we already know about this stuff. These people were on Patreon. They supported Owen and others. Then on October 9th, 2019, Patreon tortiously interfered with the relationship between Patreon or the relationship between Owen and his backers. Pretty straightforward case of tortious interference there. But they were required to first talk to Patreon and then arbitrate. So anyhow, it talks about how they talked to them on twice, but instead of resolving the situation, Patreon actually changed the rules 4 days after rejecting the last settlement offer from the defendants. Patreon changed the rules and said that if you happen to bring a claim relating to suspending or terminating another person's account, then you cannot bring a claim in arbitration. If you try to bring such a claim, you have to pay for all the damages, including attorney's fees and costs. So what this did is it removed the consumer protections. Under California consumer protection laws, no arbitrator or arbitration is allowed to charge anything to the consumers. So then it points out that Patreon lied when it claimed that defendants were given notice of the amendment. In fact, some of the defendants were not giving any notice at all. It says here that 13 of the defendants were never given notice. 21 were given notice after they filed their arbitrations, and as for the rest of them, the notice was misleading because it said that Patreon had updated the terms of use to clarify the dispute resolution process. However, they didn't clarify any rights, they simply extinguished them. I'll see if we got any questions here. Let's see here. Okay, so we don't have anything that we have to address yet, so I will continue. Okay, so basically it talks about the arbitration proceeding started in January, and then it talked about how Patreon tried to get out of the arbitration, or tried to get them all coordinated and tried to get them all consolidated. JAMS actually had to issue letters. JAMS is the arbitration system. JAMS issued a second letter on March 12th stating that JAMS would not issue a blanket stay for numerous separate arbitrations. And in fact, that's what they're asking the court for now, Patreon asked JAMS for back in February or March. So anyhow, they said, no, we won't do that. So then Patreon filed the suit for declaratory relief on 5 causes: that defendants are subject to the purported amendment, or in other words, the change in the terms of use; that defendants' arbitration claims are prohibited; that defendants' arbitration claims are not arbitrable, which the arbitrators have repeatedly ruled that they are; that the arbitration claims have damaged and will continue to damage Patreon; and that the claims of the non-California defendants are not governed by California Code of Civil Procedure. Patreon seeks a preliminary injunction asserting a likelihood of success on all 5 causes. Even before I get any further into this, I can say that's just obviously wrong. Anyhow, it talks about with the relevant legal standard. We won't get into that. So basically, the reasons that they say that it should fail is no injunction should issue because, number 1, Patreon is not likely to prevail on the merits. In fact, Patreon's request only seeks a preliminary and permanent injunction as to the second cause of action. It doesn't even seek an injunction as to the arbitrability, the applicability of California law, enforcement of the terms of use change, or the alleged damages. JAMS is the correct place. JAMS is as well positioned to determine the viability of the claims as this court is. So obviously there shouldn't be any relief given on that basis. defendants are not bound by the changes. There's no evidence defendants accepted these amended terms knowingly or otherwise, and they are unconscionable. I got it wrong. 21 of the defendants never received timely notice. 14 of them received late notice. So those should automatically be ruled out. And then the remaining 37 received the defective notice that was misleading. Furthermore, and more importantly, and this is where it gets really weird. Moreover, Patreon has not submitted any competent evidence that defendants continued to use Patreon, thereby accepting Patreon's unilateral declination, blah, blah, blah. Patreon asserts that each defendant logged into their account after January 1st. But here's the bizarre thing. None of the logins listed, and there's not 72 of them, there's like 40, were prior to the commencement of the arbitrations. So Patreon cannot say even one single defendant accepted the changes at the time they started the arbitration. I mean, it's really bizarre. They're trying to claim that because they logged into the Patreon account, that this means that they accepted the changes. But whether they accepted the changes or not is irrelevant as long as they accepted them after January 3rd when the arbitrations were filed. And the first date that Patreon provides of all the defendants is January 22nd. Some of them are as late as May. So how does somebody logging onto a system in May prove that they accepted something before January 3rd? You know, it's it's just bizarre. So anyhow, then there's some stuff about some other cases that are not really relevant or interesting, I should say. So now we're into this whole, I'm not going to bore you with the procedurally and substantively unconscionable stuff. That's judge talk. And now here's the other bizarre thing. Patreon mischaracterized defendants' arbitration claims. As shown by the actual example of an arbitration demand, defendants asserted 4 claims against Patreon, only one of which has anything to do with what Patreon is complaining about here. Like they said, you can't bring this particular claim. But the other 3 claims have nothing to do with that. So why would they stop an arbitration, even if Patreon was correct? Why would they stop an arbitration about the things that have nothing to do with this issue? It's crazy. So, and then there's the whole bit about the, it says, moreover, the ambiguous language does not actually relieve Patreon from those 2 claims. In the arbitration claims, defendants' claims are for the termination of their ability to be a patron of Mr. Smith, of Owen. They're not seeking the restoration of Owen's account, which would be a claim for the termination of it. So it's you know, I have to say, and this is something that I've noticed about Patreon's approach, is that they take a line and then they misconstrue it, they misapply it. So for example, they say, oh, well, we have the right to police your behavior on or off Patreon. And then they say, well, you said this on Twitter, so we're going to ban you. Because our community guidelines say that we can do stuff off of Twitter or off of Patreon. But here's the thing. If you read the actual language of their community guidelines, it says what they mean by off Patreon is a creation that was funded by Patreon. So your Twitter account is not funded by Patreon. Your YouTube account is not funded by Patreon. Your Facebook posts are not a Patreon-funded creation, and therefore all of their claims are based on nothing. And I mean, it's very strange to me that they don't seem to even read their own terms of use and their own community guidelines, because the agreements simply don't say what the lawyers claim that it is. It's really bizarre. In fact, the funniest thing is that the whole basis for their lawsuit has created a new cause of action, because the lawsuit is one case filed against 72 different people. Well, that's a group action. It's a grouping of parties. Now, here's the funny thing is that their terms of use says that no grouping of parties is allowed on either side. So, every single one of the 72 defendants has a, not just strong, has a black and white, open and shut arbitration case against Patreon. The agreement very clearly says no grouping of parties. Patreon went and filed a grouping of parties in the California court. They breached the contract. Boom. But here's the funny thing that tends to show that they don't really read this stuff. The language actually says no class action or other grouping of parties. And it has said that for the last 3 terms of use in a row. Who's writing this stuff? Who's reading? I mean, they're clearly not reading this stuff. It's just insane. So let's continue here. Defendants' claims are arbitrable. All the terms of use say this arbitration must be administered by JAMS, and the rules state that the arbitrator has jurisdiction and authority to decide questions of arbitrability, which, by the way, they've already decided. I mean, this has already been fought out. This is what they've been doing for the last 6 months. This has already been settled in arbitration. That's why they ran to the court, because they kept losing in arbitration. And here's the February 3rd letter. The arbitrator has the authority to determine jurisdiction and arbitrability issues. So it goes on and then says, just more boring stuff. Patreon is not damaged by arbitrating the claims. This is actually kind of funny. There's case law stating, arbitration is generally regarded as a less expensive option than litigation. In other words, what they're saying is that they can't claim to be damaged by somebody using the less expensive option. It says, and he points out that there's no grouping of parties, whether litigating the merits of the defendant's claim in the court or in arbitration. Patreon must respond to each demand separately. Patreon is simply complaining about the necessary consequences of the dispute resolution that it put in place. If arbitration were an unreasonable burden, Patreon would not put of any of its agreements. And then the obvious, Patreon is bound by California law as to all defendants. Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous. the agreement specifies California law. So the idea that they're bound by California law, but they can't appeal to California law, I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. And there's all kinds of circuit decisions and so forth that are cited. And then there's this balance of harms thing, which is incredibly boring and I'm not going to get into. And here's actually probably the best part of the whole filing, in my opinion, is they refer to this DoorDash case, which was in 2020 in a higher level federal court. And DoorDash has had to arbitrate 5,879 claims with couriers. 72 arbitrations pale in comparison with what was appropriate for DoorDash. So it's absolutely ridiculous for them to be claiming that, oh, how can we be expected to handle 72 whole arbitrations when other companies have had to do nearly, 100 times that many? And then this conclusion is really funny because he quotes they quote the decision in DoorDash where it says, for decades, the employer side bar and their employer clients have forced arbitration clauses upon workers. Dun, 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 dun. The irony in this case is that the workers wish to enforce the very provisions forced on them by seeking, even if by the thousands, individual arbitrations, the remnant of procedural rights left to them. The employer here, DoorDash, faced with having to actually honor its side of the bargain, now blanches at the cost of the filing fees it agreed to pay in the arbitration clause. No doubt DoorDash never expected that so many would actually seek arbitration. Instead, irony of irony, DoorDash now wishes to resort to a class-wide lawsuit, the very device it denied to the workers to avoid its duty to arbitrate. This hypocrisy will not be blessed, at least by this order. And then the lawyer adds, the same holds for consumers, that the court should not bless Patreon's hypocrisy. The motion for preliminary injunction should be denied. I mean, it's hard to imagine that any judge is going to disagree because it's very clear. The situation is exactly the same as it was in DoorDash. DoorDash and Patreon both have resorted to class-wide lawsuits, which was something that is specifically denied to them in their agreement in order to avoid the responsibility to arbitrate. And so, that's the situation. And, we'll have to see how it goes. I mean, obviously, anything can happen, but I have to say that of all the legal disputes that I've been involved in, this particular lawsuit filing is probably the dumbest one I've ever seen. Because, not only is it something that is basically gambling on the judge going against all the facts, all the law, all the case law, but it's also opened them up to a brand new set of arbitrations. I mean, and here's the thing that I find a little bit frustrating. It's like Compressor Bear says, unless the judge just doesn't care about your claims. Well, yeah, obviously. Well, what if you get a bad judge? What if you do? Sometimes you will. But the important thing is that even if they were able to win, then all that does is generate costs that they're going to lose on in the subsequent arbitration. Because by bringing that lawsuit, they breached the contract again. And so, and that's why I think that it's not just that it's a bad filing. It's not just it's a very weak filing, but it created a new legal liability, and that's what I find so confusing about the whole thing. Because why would you, if you're already in a dispute, if you already know that people don't like you, if you already know that they are coming after you, how does it make sense to create new vulnerabilities? How does it make sense to create new risks of damage? And so, but I think that at a certain level, I mean, obviously the lawyers are going to do what they're paid to do. They're paid to fight. They'll fight anybody about anything as long as they get paid. But it's a bit surprising to me that they would just put themselves in further jeopardy so readily, so obviously. And, it was also equal, but here's what we did learn from the Indiegogo experience, is that within these corporations, things get rolling, and then it's hard for the internal teams to stop it at the corporation, because most of the people who are involved in fighting it are the people who created the situation in the first place. And so anyhow, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. I mean, it's actually kind of nice to be able to sit back and enjoy the show. To not be responsible for anything. And, obviously I wholly support the Bears and support Owen in all of this. But it's really interesting to see the difference in the way that the, shall we say, the professional lawyers deal with this stuff compared to the Legion, which is a mix of lawyers and non-lawyers and that sort of thing. Hall Longbear says, Vox, could this open them up to suits from non-users whose purchased content was jeopardized by them removing the content creators? No, it couldn't, interestingly enough, because one of the interesting things about Patreon is that you have no responsibility to do anything at all. If you tell people that you're going to build a giant statue of Bill Gates or Barack Obama, and you get people to pledge $10 million, and you never lift a finger to build that statue, you're fine. You're absolutely fine. Unlike Indiegogo and unlike Kickstarter, where you actually do have a responsibility to do it, and they do have some refund mechanisms. A Patreon comes right out and says that a creator has no obligation to actually do anything, which is kind of crazy. But let's see here. Paul says, Vox, I thoroughly enjoy listening to the show always. Tip of the hat to you, sir. And a tip of the fedora to you as well. No, it's good to be polite. Thank you. Charlie says, hey, Vox, what is a good way to understand the doctrine of the Trinity? Thanks. Read the Bible and read the theologians who write about it. Bradley Haas does his thing, thank you. And Shoreline says, division brought to you by the Jugalu media. I suppose that's, I think that's nonsense. That's civic nat nonsense. That is civnattery, sir. Division isn't brought to you by anyone. Division is here. There is no United States nation. It doesn't exist. So when they're saying, they want to divide you, no. You live in a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-religious state. The division is structural. It's literally baked into the cake that is falling apart in clumps. Jack Cool says, for European diaspora in America, do you think one or the other is better, staying here or going to Europe, hard and fast rule style? You're where you are. I mean, like I said, the time, it is now time for people within a state to find the optimal locations in that state. This is not the time to decide that you're going to start learning Japanese or Italian or Hungarian. Look, all these here's what I don't think you don't grasp. All these people have seen what happened and what is happening where you are. They don't want a bunch of people who just let that happen come to their country and do the same kind of crap. You know? And you know, there's just no you want to be where people are going to accept you, and people are not going to accept you when you are a new arrival. You know, even stranieri like us are, you know, accepted, welcomed guests, but we're still guests. We know that. Now, we may happen to be guests that they want. We may be very, very well-behaved guests that they like, you know, but that doesn't mean that it's a good idea to start that process, start that decades-long process today. I don't think you have that kind of time. What you do have the time to do is move out of San Francisco. You do have the time to move out of, you know, wherever. But remember, you are going to be, you know, you are potentially a problem, and you will be recognized as a potential problem for the same reason that, you know, Denver and Washington and other places were Californicated by Californians who were, you know, leaving the place that they ruined. PFO asks, is there any significance to widespread signs on stores announcing coin shortages? I have no idea, unless they're trying to push, you know, cash cards or something, but I don't know. Yeah, it could be. Carbro Bear says banks are just short on coins. They just haven't had the manpower to move them. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of shipping related issues these days, as we know. Yeah, that's a good way to put it too. Don't think other nations' nationalists want foreigners coming to their country, competing against them and poaching their women. This is true. Sam Prochansky says, the Koreans in Japan have been guests for hundreds of years, and they look identical and speak the same language. Yeah, it's yeah, it's it's and this is a good point by Small Hands Bear. Advice for being a new arrival for any place or organization: listen more than you talk. Yeah, the single most irritating thing that that expats do is they talk constantly about what things are like where they're from, or they complain about what things are like where they are, and it's incredibly obnoxious. Nobody asked. Nobody cares. If you don't like it, go away, go back. And the other thing that I think that is important for people in the U.S. to understand is that life in the small villages is very, very different. You can literally see what village somebody is from simply by their facial features. The town that we were first in, the starting 11 of the town soccer team all had the same last name. And it was the same last name as the coach. The town that I played for, you could literally pick out which of the two neighboring townspeople were from by their face. In fact, the town that I played for, that was the host to my club, which actually I'm still a member of. They were well known for having attractive women. In fact, I was talking to the coach of another team, and he said, "Yeah, I always enjoy playing you guys." He said, because we were coaching the little kids, and he said, the mother's row of your team is just beautiful. And I was like, I hadn't really thought about it, because I didn't really, when you're coaching the kids and stuff, you don't pay attention. I looked over, I was like, actually, he kind of has a point. And so, but the funniest situation, the funniest story was, there was a couple that lived a few houses down from us, and my kids were playing with their grandkids, and this is years and years ago, and she asked me if I found it difficult, being stranieri, and I said, no, people are great. They're very welcoming, very very friendly. He said, oh, but it only goes so far. We have been here for 20 years and we are still outsiders. And so I thought, maybe it's because she came from a very different part of the country or something. So I said, well, where did you originally come from? She literally named the next town over. And by the way, we were so close. Where we were sitting on her front step was so close to the other town that I could literally punt a soccer ball and reach the border, get it inside the borders of the other town. So anyhow, it's you're not dealing with the same sort of situation, and that's why it's going to be much, much easier in general to move within the United States, because the higher level of generational labor mobility there makes it much more viable. So anyhow, but there's also some side benefits too. We were at a gelateria in France, and it was run by Italians. And we were actually there for a few days. We were in the town for a few days, and the kids quickly learned that you needed to order in Italian, not in French, because if you ordered in Italian, you got about 50% more. So, anyhow, Spearman Melton says, Vox, in regards to relocation, any thoughts on northwestern Florida? Destin area is 97% white, great beaches, nice area to visit. Lease, my birthplace is 4 hours drive. I mean, I lived in up in North Florida. I was in northeastern Florida, but I liked it there a lot, and so it wouldn't surprise me that would be a decent place. Stick for Stone says, Jordan Peterson's return went completely unnoticed. The wizard spell has been broken. Yeah, I think he's pretty much done. Was Yuri Bezmenov a gamma? He's tough to pinpoint. I have no clue. None whatsoever. So anyhow, that's all I've got tonight, but thanks for listening, and thanks for sitting through the talk on the legal stuff, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next Darkstream. I'm Voxday. This is the Darkstream.